Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Oxford Seminars in Cartography. My name is Nick Milley. I'm the map curator here at the Bodleian, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to a virtual Oxford this rather grey and uneventful evening here in our home city. So, without further ado, let me just make a few announcements about other cartographic events taking place in the vicinity. We usually mention Maps and Society and the Cambridge series in the history of cartography. Both of those seminar series have now concluded for this academic year. But there is another event taking place later on this evening, which is exclusively for British Cartographic Society members. And we're delighted to announce that our colleague here in the Bodleian Map Room, Debbie Hall, will be giving this evening's tea time talk. And I believe it starts at about 7 o'clock. So Debbie confirms to me across the office. So it's a 7 o'clock start this evening if you're a BCS member, and you've probably still got time to register. In terms of Tosca, we've still got 3 events to go this academic year. They're coming thick and fast. Before I mention the next 2, just to remind people that for tonight's event, should you have any questions, please pop them in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen, and Liz Bajent, my co-curator, my co-convener will curate the questions later on. So we'll be able to engage with our speaker. But before that, our next 2 seminars are in a fortnight from today, on Thursday, the 29th of May. Petter Hellström from Uppsala University in Sweden will be talking about unmapping Africa in the age of the Enlightenment. And then a couple of weeks after that, on the 12th of June, Jean-Marc Bess from l'École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris will be talking about geography and Catholic censorship in Europe at the end of the 16th century. I'd just like to remind everybody that the Oxford Seminars in Cartography are supported by the Bodleian Libraries, University of Oxford, the School of Geography and the Environment here in Oxford, also the Charles Close Society and Lovell Johns, as well as the Friends of Tosca. So, this evening, we're delighted to welcome Carolina Martínez to speak. Carolina is at the Universidad Nacional de San Martín-CONICET in Argentina. And we're thrilled to have Carolina here. She's an associate researcher at the National Scientific and Technical Research Council in Argentina. In 2014, Carolina obtained her PhD in modern history at the University of Paris 7 Diderot and at the University of Buenos Aires. She currently teaches at the University of Buenos Aires and at the Universidad Nacional de San Martín, also in Argentina, where she also conducts research on the relationship between travel accounts and cartographic images in the early modern period. She's been a visiting professor at the Universidade do Estado de Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, and also the École des Hautes Études des Sciences Sociales in Paris. In 2024, she obtained the J.B. Harley Research Fellowship for a short research stay at the British Library. And Carolina is currently a trustee of the International Society for the History of the Map, that's known as ISHMAP to its friends, as well as one of the editors of the HMAPS Digital Forum. Now, this evening, Carolina will be talking to us about trans-Pacific maritime routes and Peruvian agency in 3 17th century nautical atlases. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome Carolina to Tosca. And Carolina, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nick, for this presentation. And I would also like to thank Elizabeth and Nick for having me invited to be part of the series of Tosca and to present what I will be sharing with you today. I just share my screen and we'll start. There we go. I think you can see it in full mode.
That's
Uh,
perfect, Carolina. Yeah.
Good, thank you. So the purpose of today's presentation is to understand, at least this is what I would like to share with you today, to understand the impact or contributions of American agency, and in particular Peruvian agency, in the visualization of the South Sea through the analysis of a set of 17th century manuscript rudders, these maritime atlases. I think we can talk of them and describe them indistinctly as rudders, derroteros, maritime atlases. Um, so, in other words, what I would like to do today, or my aim today, is to examine how the production of local knowledge, economic support, and the actions and decisions of local American political figures, often in defiance with royal and Spanish regulations, shaped the ways in which the South Sea was visualized. We know that roteiros or derroteros or rudders were made to indicate the main ports and the features of a coastline, also including compass bearings connecting them, the distances between them, and in addition, they could also offer some indications regarding the water color, the appearance of certain fish, the fact that volcanoes could be extinct or active, and everything that could give a pilot an idea of their approximate location. So they were also, in general, accompanied with land-based landmarks. Here, well, there's a definition provided by the Dictionary of Cartographical and Historical References, but as you can see, these are some of the images of some of the three derroteros that we will be working with today. The description is accompanied by maps that also include descriptions, and this is followed in a sequence, right? Sometimes the descriptions were at the beginning, sometimes the descriptions were at the end, and in general, they were very detailed concerning all of these indications that were necessary to navigate safely from one port to the other, whether there were short distances or longer distances, as we will see. As noted by Rodrigo Moreno Geria and Jorge Ortiz Sotelo, considering that these maps were part of a rudder, the maps that you're seeing there above, their primary goal was to provide pilots with sufficient information and visual reference points to identify a bay and to be able to anchor with all the necessary precautions. In the case of the rudders of the South Sea, we are mainly dealing with a set of topographical coastal views of the western coasts of the America, accompanied by texts that describe in detail the type of port in question, its hazards, its characteristics of nearby populations, the resources available for resupply, which was extremely important, and the marks on the land that could be seen between one port and another to ensure safe navigation. There are at least 5 known rudders preserved in various public and private institutions throughout the world. I'm referring to the derrotero de las costas del Pacífico, desde California hasta el Estrecho de Magallanes, which is held at the Biblioteca Nacional de España, the rudder entitled Mapas de las costas de América en el Mar del Sur, desde la última población de españoles en ella, que es la ciudad de Compostela en adelante, undated and also held at the Biblioteca Nacional de España, as well as the rudders preserved in other institutions. The one in Spain, the derrotero de las costas de los reinos del Perú, Tierra Firme, Chile y Nueva España, that is held at the Museo Naval de Madrid, the derrotero general del Mar del Sur, that is held at the Society of Antiquaries of London, and the derrotero del Mar General, del Mar del Sur, desde las Californias hasta los estrechos de Magallanes y San Vicente, that is kept at the Huntington Library and is considered to be a later copy of the one preserved in the Society for Antiquaries of London. Today, I will be working with the first 3, the ones that are held in the National Library, 2 of them in the National Library in Spain, and 1 of them in the Maritime Museum of Madrid. But I think we could talk of the 5 derroteros I have mentioned in similar ways because of what I will tell you in a couple of minutes. What characterizes these rudders, all of them, the 5 that I have mentioned so far, is that the maps and descriptions of the routes to be followed for the correct navigation of the western coasts of America are presented in a north-south sequence, and that whether at the beginning or at the end of the sequence of manuscript maps, which in some cases are colored, in some cases are not, a detailed description of the routes accompanies the views of the coasts. Today, I would like to focus, as I have just told you, on the 3 rutters that are preserved in Spain. But I could choose, in fact, any of them, any of the 5 rutters, because what interests me is the sequence of coastal views that all of these rutters present, and that include all of them, and they all culminate, they all finish in a map titled The Coast Discovered by Captain Pedro Fernández de Quirós. That is, they all begin in the Baja California, in the southern parts of California, and they go drawing and describing the coasts along the American Pacific up to the Strait of Magellan. But then, as you see, I've chosen some of the maps of the sequence of the derrotero that is of the Biblioteca, one of the derroteros that is in the Biblioteca Nacional de España. And the last map that appears in the sequence is the one that is titled, sometimes it has a title, sometimes it doesn't, but it's the one describing the coast discovered by Captain Pedro Fernández de Quirós. And it comes always right after the map of the Strait of Magellan and Tierra del Fuego. Based on the notion of cartographic sequence, I am interested in analyzing the inclusion of this map, this last map, referring to the expedition in search of the Terra Australis, this famous Terra Australis that Pedro Fernández de Quirós, among many others, set sail to search and to reach between 1605 and 1606. Here is the map in full screen. The map titled The Coast Discovered by Pedro Fernández de Quirós, although it is sometimes called by another name, appears at the end of all the sequences and is a result of Pedro Fernández de Quirós' navigational experience. He departed from the port of El Callao, and this is very important. The port of El Callao is very near Lima. It's a port where all the silver from Peru, from Potosí, left the Viceroyalty of Peru to different parts of the world. We will see this later on. But what this map shows and what this map says is that he departed from the port of El Callao in 1605 and reached the present-day Vanuatu archipelago near New Guinea. Quirós named those lands, he calls them lands, but in fact this is an archipelago. He names them Australia del Espíritu Santo in honor of King Philip III of Spain and Austria, of the Austria family, and that's why the name of Austrias is included, playing with the fact that it's Austral land and the Austrias as well. That's why the name Australia del Espíritu Santo. And what particularly interests me is regarding the whole set of maps of coastal views that are included in these derroteros is whether this specific map can shed light on the whole set. That means whether this map and studying this map in connection to the rest of the maps can provide more information of the derroteros of the Southern Pacific in general and as a genre. Therefore, I am interested in this image, both for its intrinsic value, that is, the information it contains in itself, and for its relation to the whole. That means its position within a cartographical sequence. Among other questions, I would like to answer today, at least in the time we have, and probably in the questions that will follow the presentation, the following questions. Does Quirós' map at the end of the rutters complete a sequence? I mean, why is Quirós' map placed at the end of the sequence? If this is, in theory, a display of coastal views of America's Pacific. And Does it propose an image of the Pacific or of the Océano Peruvianos in which the agency of Peruvian merchants, the agency of the merchants that are based in Lima and in the port of El Callao in particular, is asserted? These are the two main questions that I would like to answer, or at least to analyze in this presentation today. I personally believe that Quiros's map at the end of the rudder's moves us away from defining the rudder's solely in relation to the American Pacific coastline, and instead positions the rudder's within the context of trans-Pacific trade routes that connected merchants on both sides of the Pacific Ocean. In fact, the presence of Quiros's map at the end of the sequence, in my opinion, evidences the importance of Peruvian agency in the production of an image of the Pacific or of the Océano Peruvianos. But how to prove this, right? And this is the question. I mean, how to prove, taking as our point of as our starting point, the analysis of this last image, this last map in the sequence of maps, how to prove that this map in particular and the whole sequence is connected and is talking about a trans-Pacific trade route and not only of whatever indications were needed to navigate within the coasts and the ports of the American Pacific. Methodologically speaking, I believe it is possible to approach this problem or to approach these questions if we combine different perspectives and methodologies. That is to say, if we study the context of production of the rudder's of the American Pacific coasts, that is, the maps and descriptions of the American Pacific coasts organized in the north-south sequence as is proposed in the derroteros, through the intersection of different disciplines and what these disciplines could bring to the table. I am referring to the history of colonial America, to the history of cartography, of course, and to the history of the early modern period, right? A first approach to the available critical bibliography reveals that although there has been, and here I'm displaying some of the bibliography and some of the works that have been done regarding either the Pacific and the connection of the American Pacific to the Asian Pacific, other works regarding the derroteros and their characteristics themselves, as the work done by Rodrigo Moreno Geria and Jorge Ortiz Sotelo. But then there are other works regarding the production of the Pacific, producing the Pacific by Mercedes Maroto Camino, or more recent works like Amerasia and the Indies of the Setting Sun by Ricardo Padrón. Amerasia is a work by Elizabeth Hodorowic and Alexander Nagel. So we have a set of works, each of them focusing on something different. There's a lot of knowledge on colonial America that needs to be studied in relation to the production of cartographic images and to the trans-Pacific commerce with the Far East, that I think could be all put together, or at least that we could take some important elements from each of these perspectives and try to see what they say or how they help us understand the production of these derroteros. Starting, as I said, with the inclusion of the map of the land discovered by Pedro Fernández de Quirós at the end of the sequence. A first approach to the available critical bibliography reveals that although there has been research on the manuscript rudders of the American Pacific, on the role of the South Sea in the Iberian world, on the unknown southern land, on the Terra Australis Incognita, and on the expeditions of Pedro Fernández de Quirós, these studies have not necessarily linked these topics with the extensive bibliography on the academies and the knowledge production spaces in the Viceroyalty of Peru, for example, or with the trans-Pacific trade orchestrated by the cities of Lima in Peru, Acapulco in the Viceroyalty of New Spain, and Manila in the Philippines in the second half of the 16th century and early 17th century. The works of Paul Firbas on the influence of classical and biblical knowledge on the understanding of a geography of the New World, and those of Mariano Boñalian on American agency in the circulation of silver and goods from the East via the Pacific, are valuable examples, I think, of how theoretically and methodologically articulate studies on colonial America that at the same time discuss relevant topics or topics that are of global interest in this period of time. From the history of cartography, it remains to explore the role of, I think, colonial agents in the production of geographical knowledge and cartographic images of unknown territories within the context of European overseas expansion and its connection, the connection of Europe with the other three parts of the world. In this sense, I consider that analyzing the criteria that led to the inclusion of Quiros's map in the cartographic sequence proposed by the derroteros offers an opportunity to understand how the visualization of the South Sea in cartographic terms was produced to understand the links established by trade networks on both sides of the ocean. Having said that, I propose to approach the problem we're facing today through the following outline. First, we will analyze the notion, or I would like to analyze the notion of cartographic sequence in relation to the rutters of the American Pacific. Secondly, I would like to focus on what we know about the last map in the sequence, the map of Pedro Fernández de Quiros's journey and its possible relationships or connections with the rutters. Third, I will study, in the time we have, what the rutters tell us about local agencies of course, in the construction of a trans-Pacific trade route and what this meant for Peruvian merchants. This point itself is divided in three parts. The commercial interests revealed by the rutters, or what these rutters tell us about the trans-Pacific trade route that actually existed between America and the Far East, the imaginaries connected with Amerasia. That's why I talk about Amerasia and the other geographical imaginaries. This is in connection to one of the publications I mentioned, one of the works that have helped me think about these connections. And thirdly, within this third point, the relationship between America and Terra Australis Incognita, or the southern land unknown. Finally, I think it will be time to reflect on some possible conclusions regarding all of these topics. So let's move on to the first part of this presentation, apart from the introduction I've just made. What the cartographic sequence tells us, or what the notion of cartographic sequence, or how the notion of cartographic sequence helps us or might help us read these rutters and the placement of the map of Pedro Fernández de Quirós at the end of the sequence. The way in which the maps and texts in the Pacific rutters are arranged invites reflection on cartographic sequences, and particularly on how the placement of a map within a sequence can reveal much about the source as a whole. In relation to the specific case studied, what is of interest here is how much information the placement of the map of the coasts discovered by Pedro Fernández de Quirós at the end of the sequence reveals about the rutters produced in the 17th century. This is one of the derroteros. I've chosen one randomly, which is the one held at the Huntington Library. We see the map of Tierra del Fuego, the Strait of Magellan, but the map that comes right after that is the Costa y estas islas que descubrió el capitán Pedro Fernández de Quirós. Regarding the inclusion of the map of Quirós towards the end of the rutters of the South Sea, recent studies have explained that instead of placing this map near the port of Acapulco in Mexico, which from a nautical perspective of the time, right, would have made much more sense given the connection of the American Pacific to the Asian Pacific through the Manila Galleon, the intention was to show a continuous line of coast throughout the Pacific. So one of the explanations that has been provided is that this map is not placed near the map of the port of Acapulco, but at the end of the sequence, because it wants to show one linear coast throughout the American Pacific. From this perspective, right, if we acknowledge, right, and we take this interpretation as valid, the rudders seem to have prioritized the desire to maintain the sequence of American coasts intact rather than following a nautical logic. A closer look at the complete sequence, however, reveals the primacy of a commercial logic, particularly of a Peruvian commercial logic. For the placement of Quiros's discovery that you are seeing right now at the end of the sequence connects the port of El Callao in Peru, from which Quiros departed in 1605, with Manila, the port of Manila, and the port of Acapulco. If we think about how cartographic series are composed, the first conclusion we can draw is that the arrangement of a map in a sequence, or its spatialization in a sequence, produces meanings that articulate the specificity of each image with the connection generated in the simultaneous observation of the whole series. That means that one image provides or helps to bring meaning to the whole series. In the same vein, the placement of a map in the vicinity of New Guinea with a cartographic sequence of the American Pacific can tell us a great deal about the uses, recipients, and the circulation of the rudders as a whole. If we look at the map of the coast discovered by Captain Pedro Fernández de Quirós, we will see that beyond the difference in the title, or the fact that it may not have any title, I'm going to show you the same version of the map in different derroteros, right? Some are more elaborate, some are less elaborate. But we will see that if we look at the map, we will see that the text that describes the map is the same in most of the rudders that are currently known, right? I'm talking about the text that in this case appears at the bottom of the map. In this case, it appears to the side of the map. Here, it appears above. Here, it also appears above. But all of these texts say exactly the same thing. In fact, in all of these texts, there is a reference of the discoveries made by Pedro Fernández de Quirós and the islands, the coastal islands that he discovers. And he says as follows, I'm going to translate the text in Spanish to English. It says, this coast and these lands are those where Captain Pedro Fernández de Quirós was, who left the port of El Callao with 2 ships for this discovery. And while between these islands, he faced a harsh storm and entered with his ship into the Bay of San Felipe and Santiago, which are the bays that are shown there, where it was repaired. And Luis Baez de Torre, the pilot of the flagship, sailed down the coast and ended up in Manila. The year is missing, right? In all of these cases. The references to the port of El Callao, from where Quirós departed in 1605, and to the arrival of Luis Baez de Torres in Manila, make Quiros's map a cartographic image in between. And what do I mean by a cartographic image that is in between? What I mean is that although it is placed at the end of the sequence and expresses a geographical beyond, if we are to believe Pedro Fernández de Quirós, that this is Australia del Espíritu Santo, that this is the southern land unknown. Its unknown coasts, although it is placed at the end of the sequence, its unknown coasts and islands operate by linking two known spaces. Manila, where Luis Baez de Torres sails to after this severe storm that separates two ships, and the port of El Callao, where the whole expedition had set sail from. From a distinctive American perspective, as expressed in the Rutters, the visualization of the Pacific not only connects the Eastern and the Western Indies through text and images, but it also is concretized through the maritime explorations organized and financed by the agents of Lima. So Quirós, at least in this map, is explaining, right? Or there is an explanation about Quiros's expedition, saying that he left from the port of El Callao, that he arrived to the southern land unknown, that there was a very big storm, and that due to this storm, the two ships of the expedition were divided. One went to Manila, and the other one went to Acapulco. This is not said in this text. We know that Quirós decided to return to America, but instead of returning to the port of El Callao, he returned to Acapulco, which was the most important city regarding the Trans-Pacific trade routes at the time. The references to the port of El Callao and to Luis Baez de Torres' arrival in Manila, as I said, make this map a map in between the unknown and the known routes of navigation and main ports. In Amerasia, this book I mentioned that was published recently by Elizabeth Holorowicz and Alexander Nagel, both authors use the term elliptical continuity to refer to the textual structure of travelogues and cosmographic literature in general, and their tendency, this is what they say, to bring far apart places into proximity and to facilitate movement among them while minimizing the reality of the expanses or oceans separating them, the vastness of which were, after all, known only to relatively few who had marched or sailed across them. End of the quote. While it is difficult to think that someone consulting these rutters would not have understood that the distances separating one port from another were considerable, it cannot be ruled out that the formation of sequences of not necessarily close places aimed to create economic, political, and even cultural links between these parts. There are other indicators of the inter-Pacific trade between Acapulco, Lima, and Manila in the selected rutters. We will see them very shortly. I will just say a couple of them. In the Mapas de las Costas de América, for instance, one of the rutters I have mentioned, the introductory text alludes to the possible creation of an alternative route between the Philippines and Acapulco, and talks about the lucrative silks, spices, the lucrative trade of silk, spices, and silver between the East and the West Indies. At the same time, in the text written behind the map of Quiros's coasts, somebody, right, what is handwritten refers to the expeditions that left Peru in search of the riches of the Solomon Islands, which was an expedition that had been done before, and in which Pedro Fernández de Quirós had participated, accompanying Álvaro de Mendaña. Let's see what the last map in the sequence tells us specifically about this interest of the Lima merchants in organizing expeditions to the Far East, and of course possibly finding points in between, right, places to stop in between this extremely long trans-Pacific trade route that joined or wanted to join, aspired to join Lima or the port of El Callao to Acapulco. What do we know about this last map specifically? The last map in the sequence, as I have just said, refers to the bay discovered by Pedro Fernández de Quirós, the Vanuatu archipelago, during his second voyage in search of Terra Australis Incognita. This voyage, as I have just explained, should be interpreted within a broader framework of expeditions organized from the Americas themselves, and specifically from the port of El Callao, under the sponsorship of the Viceroy of Peru, right? The person in charge after the king, the most important person in America were these viceroys. And in the case of the person in charge in Peru at the time, he was extremely interested in financing, sponsoring, helping whatever commercial expedition was organized in search of new land or in search of convenient trade routes across the Pacific, right? And he, of course, sponsored and helped the Lima merchants during the last quarter of the 16th century and the early 17th century. Here I'm displaying the whole set, right, of maps so that you see. And let's go specifically to the information that is provided in the last map. Here is a map that was done later on in the translation of the many sources that remain of Pedro Fernández de Quiros's expedition, right? As I said before, the expedition that is portrayed in the map, the last map of the sequence, was not the first one. In fact, Quiros had participated of another expedition, and it wasn't the first time that the Peruvian merchants had sponsored and had wanted to organize expeditions to search the southern land known and, conveniently enough, find a trade route to the Far East. In fact, on his first voyage to the Solomon Islands, Mendaña had departed also from El Callao with captains Pedro Sarmiento de Gamboa and another captain called Pedro Ortega. He had done a second voyage, Álvaro de Mendaña, authorized and sponsored as well by the Viceroy of Peru, Garcia Hurtado de Mendoza. He had reached the Marquesas Islands and died, and had left his wife, Isabel de Barreto, in charge of the whole expedition and of the people that had come with him in the expedition. And then Pedro Fernández de Quirós, who had accompanied Álvaro de Mendaña in his last expedition, set sail from El Callao in 1605. That is a map that is the one placed at the end of the derroteros, on a new attempt, also with the help of the Lima authorities and its most prominent merchants, to gain access or to find an eastern trade route through the South Sea. If we examine the accounts of Quirós and of Luis Báez de Torres, this was the second man in command and the one that had gone to Manila instead of staying in the southern land. And if we examine those accounts and the maps produced by Diego de Prado y Tovar, an example of a map produced by Diego del Prado y Tovar of the Bahia de San Felipe and Santiago. This is a map that is very similar to the one that is later on placed in the derroteros. And here is a map done apparently by Pedro Fernández de Quirós himself. We know that during the expedition, Quirós had also drawn several charts in the Relación de Méritos, that is the petition for royal favor that Quirós writes after the first expedition that he does, in which he accompanies Álvaro de Mendaña. He notes that he has done 5 nautical charts that were used during the voyage. He says 1 for General Mendaña, 1 for himself, and 3 others for each of the pilots of each of the remaining ships in the fleet. So we know that there were several maps that were produced in the context of Pedro Fernández de Quiros's expedition, right? There's an example, another example, another example. Now, insofar as a map So these were individual maps, maps that were produced in the context of the expedition of Pedro Fernández de Quirós. Now, if these maps are removed from the context in which they were originally produced and copied, adapted, and inserted in a new sequence or a new context, its original meanings change. In other words, as new sequences are created, new meanings are also generated. So we go back to the question, our starting question, which was, what is the meaning then of Quiros's map and the references to Mendaña's voyage within these rutters? Local agencies and the search of a trans-Pacific trade route for Peruvian merchants. Regarding the commercial interests present in the derroteros, right? What we know so far, and here is what I mentioned before in these images that are the texts that are written together with the maps, and all of them are part of the derroteros. We see that there are mentions to Peru, mentions to Acapulco, mention to the Philippines, and descriptions on how to get from one place to the other. This we know from the derroteros themselves. But what we know also, and what we know so far, is that trans-Pacific trade routes existed beyond the interdictions of the Spanish crown. This means that Lima's trade with the Philippines was organized around the approval of local officials, but without the approval of royal authorities. That means that they were organized despite royal interdictions. At the same time, Lima's political and mercantile elite attempted to participate in Asian trade by different means, right? There was, in fact, a royal decree issued in 1604 that aimed to exclude Lima merchants from Asian trade. And at the same time, we know that that period, 1604, shortly before and shortly after 1604, that was the period of the highest level of commercial relations between Peru and the Philippines, China, and the East, right? So there is a royal interdiction, but at the same time, we see the Lima merchants are constantly trading with Asia along two different routes, all of them leaving from the port of El Callao, right? The prominence of El Callao in organizing the Pacific expeditions is vital to understand the organization of the sequences of the derroteros, right? So one of the other things we know is that the trade networks woven outside of royal consent seem to be evident in the surviving derroteros. Their handwritten nature, the almost non-existent identifications of authorship, we don't know who made these derroteros, the absence of any mark of royal power or the presence of the Spanish crown in these derroteros are elements to consider regarding the fact that commerce actually existed, that a trans-Pacific trade route leaving from El Callao actually existed, and that this was in fact forbidden by the Spanish crown. From Peru, there were two trans-Pacific trade routes. I don't know if is there any indication of time or? So I'll continue.
All good, Carolina.
All good. Sorry, I just saw something appear in the chat, and as I'm showing the PowerPoint, I wasn't able to read it. So from Peru, there were two trans-Pacific trade routes to reach Asia. One that went directly from El Callao to China and to the Philippine Islands, and an indirect route that first got to Acapulco, and from Acapulco sailed to the Far East. This was also an official route. That means that from Acapulco to Manila, there was a famous Manila galleon that transported merchandise, and especially silver, from America to the Far East. But apart from that, the Peruvian merchants organized a trade route that allowed navigation, and that was a fact, navigated from the Callao to Acapulco, even though navigation between these two ports was forbidden. The Crown also forbade the navigation of ports within America. And all of these derroteros are showing that if there are instructions to navigate from one port to another in the Americas, it means that people are actually navigating from one port to another in the Americas, right? At the same time, we also know I'm talking about all the evidence that appears in the derroteros showing that these routes actually existed, and that the derroteros are not only showing what happens in America, but are in straight connection with what happens and the interests that the Americans, Spanish Americans, have in Asia. If we look at the detours, right, detours, unfortunate detours due to storms, such as that of Luis Baez de Torres, who ended up in Manila, right, as indicated in one of the derroteros, we also see that this was common practice, right? In many cases, the announcement that because of a storm, the ship had to detour and ended up somewhere else is very common practice to indicate that a decision has been taken regarding the exploration of further routes or the attempt to test whether it was possible to navigate from this Bahia of San Felipe and Santiago straight to the Philippines. Although briefly, the analysis of some elements present in the derroteros seems to account for these customary practices and help characterize the cartographic genre of the derroteros. They are, as I was saying just now, informal productions that is non-official, probably, and marginal in relation to royal provisions, as it is precisely the navigation of the American coasts and their trans-Pacific connection that the derroteros address. Indeed, if Spain's intention was to marginalize Peru from trade with the East, the derroteros seem to demonstrate quite the opposite. As we have seen so far, their eminently practical nature and their informal character reveal the existence of real merchant circuits outside royal interdictions and provisions. In agreement with other sources of the period, which I will not talk about today, the derroteros then demonstrate that the entire coastal region of South America, and not only Acapulco, was involved in Asian trade. Regarding their dating, that means when exactly these derroteros were made, except for some specific references, it has not been possible to precisely date when the surviving copies were made. Considering that informal trade centered in Lima developed during the peak of Potosí silver production, and this is very important, right? The silver that was produced in Potosí and the peak of silver production coincides with the period in which we assume most of the derroteros were produced, at least the first version, right? Then there were many copies. In fact, many of the surviving derroteros, or the derroteros that we know nowadays, are copies of copies whose origins probably date back to the late 16th and especially the early 17th centuries, right? And that were later on copied and recopied. And in these new copies, further maps were added, right? These derroteros follow the sequence I explained. All of them show the land discovered by Pedro Fernández de Quirós at the end, but within the sequence, depending on the derrotero, some maps are added, some maps are missing, right? There are changes. They're not all exactly the same, one to the other. Here we have one of the derroteros, the one in the Mapas de las Costas that is held in the Biblioteca Nacional de España, we see again the reference in the maps of the Solomon Islands that were discovered by Álvaro de Mendaña, that he left from the port of El Callao. And this is very interesting as well. He says, this map says, how many miles away from El Callao these islands were. So the point of reference is El Callao, right? And this speaks a lot about local agency. When I mean local, I mean American agency and Peruvian agency, right? These maps are produced and have meaning to merchants and people that are interested in commerce in the American Pacific regarding the commerce that could be attained and could be reached in the Far East. Same thing here. It's the same derrotero I've chosen. The first of the maps, that is the map of the port of Acapulco, says, por esta canal entran las naos de China, right? This is the way in which the ships from China, with all the, it wasn't Chinese ships, right? It was Spanish ships that were bringing Oriental merchandise to be silks. Remember the silks and everything that I talked about at the beginning of the presentation. So if we look at all of these images carefully, we will see that there is constantly references to a triangular commercial or triangular commerce, right? Acapulco, Lima, and Manila in the Philippines. Let's talk about, and in fact, sorry, one last image. I'm sorry about the quality of this one in particular isn't very good. This is a one that is in the Maritime Museum in Madrid. If we look at this sequence, I've given a few examples of the beginning of the sequence, a few examples of the middle of the sequence, and what happens at the end of the sequence. And there we see, to your left, the map of Patagonia and Tierra del Fuego. Shortly after, right next to it, the map of the coast discovered by Pedro Fernández de Quirós. There is an island there near Chile, and the last map of this sequence, the one right after the map of Pedro Fernández de Quirós, is the one you see to the far right and below, which is a map of Manila, of the city of Manila, and it indicates how you have to navigate, right, to arrive safely to the port of Manila. So this is also, it's the last of the sequence, but it's part of a circuit, right? It's not a line, but a circuit of commercial routes and interests and people, of course, because the Peruvian agents were not only in Peru, but they had their bases and they had entrepôts in Mexico and in the Philippines as well. Now, yes, let's move on to Amerasia. And what can we say about Amerasia? And I'm going to speak less about this than what I have just spoken. While the derroteros or these maritime atlases clearly reflect commercial and economic objectives, as we have just seen, I think they also reveal a set of imaginaries associated to the South Sea, the Terra Australis Incognita, and the links with Asia that were envisioned from Peru, especially, through a notion or building on the notion of a shared history. What do I mean with this? We must not forget that alongside the political and economic context in which these rutters were created, there was also an intellectual context. The connection between the Americas and the Far East was not only or solely commercial, it was also embedded in a specific conception of the South Sea as a shared geographic and cultural space. This vision is also present in the Memoriales written by Pedro Fernández de Quirós. The other sources, right? The sources that I said remain from Pedro Fernández de Quirós' expedition to the southern land, in which he says, in one of the Memoriales, which he writes from Cartagena de Indias in Panama in 1598, right after he has returned from the first expedition in which he accompanied Álvaro de Mendaña, he remarks that the islands discovered by Mendaña were very similar to the lands of Peru and could very well contain gold, silver, and pearls, just as Peru did. And he says something, he phrases it in a strange way, because he doesn't deny and he doesn't confirm the fact that there might be pearl, silver, and gold in the southern land or in these coasts that he has discovered. He says, it's a translation I've done, gold, silver, and pearls in those islands I cannot say I saw, nor can I say I did not see, for they were never sought, they never looked for them. But I say that the land, the climate, and the regions are much like other lands where pearls, gold, and other riches are found. And there he compares the skies of Peru and the celestial influences on Peru and the celestial influences on the southern land. And he concludes that, and this I quote, the same power should have the same power of the sun, the moon, and the stars should have the same effect in one place as in the other. All are within the same zone and parallels, and God created both. So there is this effort to join, intellectually speaking, right? And Quiros is not the only one, to join and to find correspondences and to find links between the Far East and the American Pacific coast, and even the inhabitants of America, right? The pre-Columbian inhabitants of America, in especially by the Peruvian intellectual circles that are trying to connect both areas, right? In fact, at the time that the rutters were produced, Lima's local elites were also reflecting on Peru's relationship with the East. There's this work written by Miguel Cabello de Balboa called the Miscellanea Antarctica in 1586, in which he associates the origins of the pre-Columbian inhabitants of Peru with the mythical port of Ophir and the fortune of King Solomon. And this is in direct relation to the fact that Álvaro Mendaña decides to baptize the islands he arrives to as Solomon Islands, right, during his 1568 expedition. And many other references at the time, especially in the intellectual circles of Peru, that are trying to connect the islands of Ophir that were described by in the Bible, right, as the islands where King Solomon had his riches, to the Far East and to Peru, right? Silver producing Peru at the time that helped establish these connections. Let's move on to the last part, which is the connections between America and Terra Australis Incognita as they appear in the derroteros, right? When comparing the sequence of the derroteros with world maps produced from the late 16th century onwards, particularly those that include a depiction of Terra Australis occupying much of the South Pacific, we see the following, right? We see that there is, that if this sequence is organized in a way that the last map of the sequence is a map of the lands discovered by Pedro Fernández de Quirós, this might also be in connection to the images, the cartographic images that circulated of the southern land known at that time, which is a southern land known that begins, right, or that has one of its parts near New Guinea and near the Solomon Islands and stretches, right, almost diagonally speaking, up to Tierra del Fuego, right, or up to the south of America's Patagonia, right? We have several examples of this where the Solomon Islands and, in fact, we see close up here, Océano Peruano. You see how, intellectually speaking, there are efforts to make this ocean part of the same cultural system, right? And in this case, a map that was done further on, we see that even the lands of Quir, right, of Pedro Fernández de Quirós, the Bay of San Felipe and Santiago, is part of a possible southern land known where there's a green line trying to join, right, the south of South America to, or the tip of Tierra del Fuego to the proximities to New Guinea, right? And Quirós himself seems to have had such cartographic images in mind. I mean, these are cartographic images that circulate at that period, right? And in one of the memoriales, again, one of the sources, where he addresses and he describes what he has found, he describes all of this to the king, he infers that if one were to sail south of the islands that were discovered during the expedition of Mendaña, right, the ones that are circled there, it would be possible to find the Terra Australis Incognita. This is what he says in the written sources that he addresses the king, right? Once he discovers, this is before he discovers, in between inverted commas, the bays of San Felipe and Santiago, Quiros identifies these bays as part of the Terra Austral Incognita, and he says that whatever is found in those lands could benefit the people from Peru, right? He says, I note that among the greatest benefits of these discovered lands is the great relief that they could provide to the kingdoms of Peru and New Spain by absorbing the many surplus and unsettled people they contain, right? So Quiros is already thinking of the possible connections between Lima, Peru, and whatever he has found or he thinks he has found in the proximities of New Guinea. To conclude, by studying the cartographic sequence presented in 3 rutters, we could say the 5 rutters of the South Sea throughout this presentation, I have sought or I have wanted to explore the processes by which unknown territories were incorporated into existing chains of geographical or topographical reference. The analysis of the possible criteria behind the inclusion of Pedro Fernández de Quiros's map towards the end of the sequence has revealed how, I hope I have proved this, how between the 16th or the late 16th century and the early 17th century, rutters produced in the context of trans-Pacific navigation incorporated information generated by local agents for commercial purposes, such as ensuring the profitable trade between Lima, Acapulco, and Manila. In this sense, their existence, right, the existence of these rutters, could be read as further evidence that trans-Pacific commercial relations existed beyond the prohibitions imposed by the Spanish crown. At the same time, these rutters also presented an image of the South Sea that highlights Lima's central role, or Peru's central role, in organizing expeditions in search of trade routes to the east or to the unknown southern land. As in the case of Quiros's map, the choice of the name Solomon for the islands discovered by Álvaro de Mendaña and the connection between Peru and the mythical Ophir through the proposed ancestry of Peru's indigenous peoples must also be considered part of the intellectual context, as I have just said, in which these rutters were produced. The connection between the Americas and the East was not only commercial in nature, but also articulated through the image of the South Sea that was produced in these maps and in the sources that were connected to them. In this regard, although some of these questions, and some of the questions I have asked myself in thinking of this presentation and here today with you, although some of them are still to be explored and still remain to be answered, I hope that the analysis of the rutters presented today and of Quiros's map in particular has shed light on the agendas, the political positions, and the epistemological criteria involved in the conceptualization of the South Sea, as well as its role in articulating American territory in connection with the East Indies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carolina. I really enjoyed that. Very intriguing presentation. You threw up all sorts of connections and different ideas to try to connect. Thank you. So, may I invite our audience to pose their questions to Carolina, which she's kindly agreed to answer. You'll see that there are two boxes at the bottom of your screen. Please don't put your questions in the chat because we might miss them. Please instead put them in the Q&A box, and then we'll pick them up, and Carolina is going to answer them for us. So while our audience is thinking about their questions, could I ask you just to tell us a little bit more about a couple of things that you told us at different points in your presentation? You mentioned centers, knowledge production spaces in Peru, and then you mentioned circulation of information. At another place you mentioned information coming from merchants, and then you mentioned copying and recopying the rutters. I wonder if you could just bring those bits of information together and tell us a little bit more about how the rutters were produced and whom they circulated to, and how they were kept up to date, copied, recopied, that kind of thing.
Elizabeth, do you want me to answer that
Yes.
question first and then
Yeah, and then we'll go to the others. Yeah, thank you.
okay. Well, I mean, the starting point of all of this is that rutters are very elusive as sources because we don't have a lot of information of who produced them, when they produced them, and the whole life they had and how they're circulated and how they were copied, except for the information that the rutters provide themselves, right? And we can see in one of the slides I put the 5 versions of the land discovered by Quiros, and we saw that some were very elaborate versions. They were colored. They were even there's one that I did not include in the Hispanic Society. That's a private collection. So well, that is even colored in a very refined way, and then there are others that seem to be like a draft copy of something, right? The one that was just not scribbled, but and I think that the information that is provided or that we gain from seeing these images and seeing the information and seeing how sometimes one copy includes 2 more maps that another copy does not have, I think that tells us a lot about the I don't want to use the word marginal. I used it in the presentation, but the fact that these are not documents that are produced with the consent of the Spanish crown. I mean, because when you see something that has been produced with the consent of the Spanish crown, it is full of indicators of authorship, of authority, of who this is addressed to. And these are rutters these rutters, right? They're just there, right? And they're giving a lot of information of who might have been interested in these rutters, right? How they circulated. And then, of course, I mean, they have historical value, and that's why they're kept in these very important libraries. And because of the use they had, there are very few surviving copies that we know of, at least, because these were used in navigation, right? I mean, this was like a handbook for being able to get from one point A to point B without suffering too much in the middle, right? And I think that that's the nature of these rutters, but at the same time, we don't have much information on them. So it's like a very detailed, the work that has to be done with them has to be very detailed in trying to find the hints of whomever could have produced them. Of course, merchants are involved with this because there's a wish to commerce, and these trading routes exist despite the fact that the crown doesn't want them to exist. And I think that tells us a lot about the genre of the derroteros, right? But it is a big incognita in many, sort of, there are many blanks in our knowledge of, I wish, well, I would be very happy to. I've read a lot about them, and the feeling is mutual. I mean, there are many other people that are working on this that also find that these rudders are quite elusive in the information they can give us on who, when, where, what, and all of these things, right?
Thank you. That helps to set things in context, I think. So we've got a number of questions coming through. That if we could turn to those. A question by Paul Hughes. He points out that there's a lack of numbers on the charts about courses, latitudes, distances, soundings, and so on, suggesting a supernumerary author. Does it question the descriptor doterio?
There's one thing interesting. Well, I didn't stop in that, but the derroteros are very much in line. The type of information they provide is very much in line with the portulanos, right? That do not use or are not thinking in terms of coordinates, but in terms of coastal navigation, right? Even though the last of the last of the maps is there has to be a huge navigation to get from Lima to the coast discovered by Fernández de Quirós. All of the information that is provided has to do with visualizing the coasts, right? And they work in that way, which is a very different way to maps that are in sort of Ptolemaic in the Ptolemaic grid. Now, what is important is that if we think of these derroteros, but we also think of the maps that were produced by Fernández de Quirós. Apparently, he was a very good map maker. He had a lot of experience in that. He is, and in the sources that survive of whatever he observed, he's all the time talking about the leagues, you know, how long it took in leagues, the altitude, not the longitude, right? Because we know that this is something that will be developed towards the late 18th century. But he has all this in mind, and he knows that, and this is something that I didn't mention either, but that a lot of this, the success of this navigation depends also on the currents. And it was very difficult. It was easier to go from the American Pacific to the Far East than returning, because you had to go further north to find the current that took you back to California. In fact, that's why part of the circuit is many times they arrive from the Far East to the north, to the south of North America, but to the north of Mexico, we could say. And this is something that they have to bear in mind, because not finding the right tides, the right winds meant probably death. I mean, if they had this calm for several days, several weeks, well, this was like a murder sentence or a death sentence, sorry, to the people returning. I don't know if this answers the question, but it is more, the derroteros are more in the line of the portulanos than Mercator maps or Ortelius or all the other the Ptolemaic grid type of maps.
Yeah, thank you. That's helpful. And then we've got a question from Brendan White, who asks, and you may want to go back to a slide. He asks, in your slide with all the maps in sequence, on the bottom map, a bottom row, the middle map of New Guinea and the last one of Manila look very similar in coastline and island size / shape / layout. Is this coincidence or error or deliberate obfuscation?
I'll go back to that one.
That one, all of them in sequence.
Yes, it was further up. Wait. Sorry, I'm moving them too fast. That one.
But that's the one. So he's asking particularly about on the bottom row, the middle map of New Guinea, and then the last one, the one of Manila.
Yeah, the one to the far right below, right?
Yeah.
What I think happened in this case, this is the derrotero that if you see the whole, it's available online and has been published in the form of a book. But if you see the whole sequence, you will see that this derrotero in particular has a lot of additional maps, right? That were probably, well, added further on. And in fact, at the beginning of the derrotero, the person that, anonymous person that compiles or says to have compiled and made the set, right, says that he has deliberately added maps that he thinks might be useful, right, and that he found later on. And I think that the map of Manila has been an additional, right, it's an addition that is not, at least might be of a further on, right, or at least another date than the rest of the sequence. And in that case, it might be a repetition. You know, sometimes there are some traits or some elements that repeat. And in fact, yes, if you look at it, now that he's saying it, there is a very close resemblance between one and the other. But this might be probably because it's an addition. And the person that did that map in particular was not looking at the whole sequence, or it's something that happened like an ad hoc inclusion, right, in the sequence. That's my explanation, but I'm willing to hear any other option.
Thank you. That'll be something to ponder on now. It's been pointed out. Thanks to Brendan for that. So next question from John Doctor. He said, you showed us unapproved trade routes from Peru. Was there any trade from other South American ports, for example, in Chile?
That's a good question. There is, and this is something that Quiros mentions, one of the ports where they, one of the places where they also wanted to depart from America, apart from El Callao, was La Serena, which is a place in Chile. At that time, right, early 17th century, the Viceroyalty of Peru was a huge, covered a huge extension, and Chile was part of it. So they would have anyway left from Peru, but it was further south, right? Some degrees south. And Quiros says that the interest, he says, if we cannot leave from Peru, we will leave from this place in Chile, right? But that will depend on the tides and the weather and the time of the year in which we leave. He has a lot of information he has to take into account to choose what the right place to leave from is. But yes, I would say that was another possibility, of course, less popular, let's say, already in the prohibited, in the section of things that were not to be done. The first thing that was not to be done was leaving from Peru, and a less attractive place was leaving from La Serena, but it was also contemplated as a possible way to leave. But I would say that the main place that you should not leave from, and that they actually left from, was El Callao. But they did contemplate other places, especially for weather conditions, climate, etc.
Yep. Thank you. And then we've had lots of comments in the questions box, just saying how much people have enjoyed your seminar. So that's good. And then we have one question, which maybe I could just sort of roll in with a one of my own. Nikki Fila asks, what was the starting point for your research? And I was going to ask how you plan to develop your research further. So I wonder if you could just tell us that to round off the evening.
Good. The starting point was a question. I think there were two starting points. I wanted to, and I had been thinking a lot about the idea of a sequence. I mean, how do sequences of images and sequences of maps help us understand the whole lot of images that are introduced, right? How does the series or the sequence provide more information than just the single map in the sequence, right? So, and I found, well, derroteros were the perfect place to work with the idea of sequence, because a series of topographical views were a sequence. There were not only a series, but a sequence, right? There was an importance of putting one first, then the other, then the other. Uh, and then, you know, when I started looking at these derroteros, what surprised me was a contradiction between the title that had been assigned to the derroteros, to the rutters, and what I actually saw in the rutters, because the titles were in general maps of the coasts of America's Pacific. And the emphasis was always in America, 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 and America. But always the last map of the sequence was a map that was not America, right? I mean, it was, I always expected to find Patagonia, Tierra del Fuego, the Strait of Magellan, and that was the end of it. But what I found always was, or at least I found it in the first derroteros I worked with, was the appearance of this coast discovered by Pedro Fernández de Quirós. And that was not America, of course. But Quirós claimed that it was the southern land. So did that have to do with the way in which southern land came after America, in the way that it was drawn in most of the maps of the period? Did it have to do with the trade routes and the interest of the Lima merchants with, you know, filiating or finding a way to connect to the Far East? And that opened a whole set of questions. And in fact, I'm still trying to answer why there's a map of the lands discovered by Pedro Fernández de Quirós at the end of, well, apocryphal titles, right? Because these derroteros didn't have, in many cases, they didn't have a title. Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. But then there was probably a different way of reading these maps and a different way of reading the sequence if we took into account all of these things that I mentioned today, right? So how does this continue? I would like to write an article with, you know, saying at least what I have found so far, and also to find people to discuss these things, right? Because as I was saying also at the beginning of the presentation, there's a lot of things that, or a lot of information that has been analyzed from people working colonial American history, other people working history of cartography, and I think it's good to put all these text and research that is incredible and that is very specific together and see what comes out of trying to understand one source, one genre within the history of cartography, that is the rutters, in dialogue with everything that has been said regarding commerce, Potosi, silver mining, the Pacific, the southern land, you know, and make them dialogue in, at least in the form of an article at first.
Well, we wish you all the best with that. It'll
Thank
be
you.
intriguing to see your sort of fully worked out ideas, because you've given us a lot to think about this evening.
Thank
So,
you.
on behalf of all our audience and Nick and Stuart at the Bodleian, could I thank you very much indeed for joining us this evening? Could I thank the audience for joining us and being such an attentive and a lively audience with lots of questions. And we hope to see many of you again on the 29th of May, when, as Nick mentioned, Peter Hellström is lecturing to us on mapping Africa. So we wish you a very good evening from Oxford, or good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are in the world. And we look forward to your company soon. And we finish again with renewed thanks to Carolina. Thank you. Good night.